speaker today. Our speaker actually is really involved in the Montreal community. It's his second presentation he's doing with us, and he's also behind the scene helping out for the website and on GitHub, which is an open source project for everyone to participate in. And other than that, during the day, he works at Alaya Care since 2015. And he's been really involved into Vue.js since 2017, when they took their old legacy app and moved forward with the integration of Vue.js in it. And today, he's going to talk about the CSS side of Vue.js. And so, I know you won't be able to clap, but still, please help me welcome Stéphane Reiss.
There's a little icon in the participant panel.
Oh, yeah,
so
you
I'm
can
going to wave.
virtual clap.
It's not really a clap. There's, oh, they got rid of the clap.
Awesome.
Oh, okay, anyway, it's there.
To you, Stéphane.
Yeah. Thank you, Tommy. Thank you for letting me doing a second presentation here in Vue Montreal. Okay, I'm going to show my screen here. Cool. So I'm also gonna open the participant box. So if you have questions, you don't have to wait the end of the presentation to ask your question. You can either unmute yourself, or I'm gonna keep an eye on the chat as well. I'm gonna open the box now, and I'll try to answer the questions as soon as I see them. Cool. Yeah, today we're gonna talk about CSS in Vue Components. But I must warn you, my CSS skills are very low. So I'm gonna keep talking about the CSS management. And so don't try to ask too specific questions around CSS. I mean, I won't be able to answer if it's too much in details. But anyway, let me start with my introduction. So I'm a web developer. I have a backend background, but over the few last years, I used JavaScript a lot, and I really love JavaScript. So I've been involved in a few projects in JavaScript at Alaya Care, doing some front-end work. And I also like Magic, the Gathering, the card game, and Arduinos and Legos, and sometimes I mix all of that to do some funny projects, like the one you can see here on the screen. If you have questions about that, feel free to ask me at the end of the presentation. This is the agenda for today's presentation. And like I said, I won't talk specifically about CSS, like tips or tricks, more about how you manage CSS in Vue Components. And this is basically the only slide you would need here, because it has everything like the scope style, the module style, everything around the style elements is on this page. Single file components. Oh, wait. Okay, cool. So basically in Vue.js, a single file component is a file where the extension is .vue here, like you can see app.vue. This is a single file component. And in that file, you have everything to build your component, from the template, which represent the DOM of your component, the HTML of the component, the style tag here to have your CSS, and also the script tag, which I don't have here because it's not needed for the exercise. So I created this app.vue component here, which is basically a small app with a header, some links on the header, and a placeholder for the contents here. And I've done some styling here, basic styling. And what we're gonna explore tonight is how Vue and actually the Webpack loaders transform this into this. Okay, so as you can see, the file that, the code that I showed renders like this, the links on the top with a small background here. And on the right, it's actually the source code generated by Vue style loader here. So the first thing to know is Vue loader will transform this tag here into this code on your browser. And to know how it works, how it does that, I've like explored in the Vue style loader the actual code, and you can, if you want to go into details, this file, this JavaScript file here is actually taking your style tag and inject, I can show you quickly, and inject into the document like this, creating an on-the-fly style element of type text CSS, and then append it to the head here. Okay, and that's how Vue style loader injects your code into the web page, basically. Okay. The next thing we want to do is to see how different components, when you assemble them together, make a page, like compose a page. So here I created another component called content.view here. Again, small component with some HTML here. This is it has a sidebar on the left with some tabs and the main content in the middle here. This is the style for this component. You probably can, you can see that my CSS skills are very basic. I like float a lot, but I know that there are like way more advanced like flexbox and grid CSS. But anyway, I stick with float for some reason. Okay, so this is my content component. Now I want to put that content inside my main component app.view here. So what I do is, here's the script tag. I just import the component, I export, I make it available on my template like this, and then I just put content into the placeholder. Now, when you're doing that, it renders like this. And you can see that it's kind of broken because the header here, the links, they are not like fixed at the top. The sidebar tab is has a black background and it's all messed up. And this is how the source code now looks like. It has two style tags, and you can see that this is why it's broken, because the nav class here is defined 2 times. Okay, and so they conflict each other. Okay, so how do we fix that? First tips, scope style. So going back to the source code, you look at both components, and all you have to do to fix the issue is to add scope. And by doing that, it actually fixes the problem. Now my header, it looks the way it was, and I have my sidebar here. But probably some of you noticed that it's not exactly fixed because I have some padding around the header, around the body here. So let's have a look at what the scoped attribute does in details. Looking at the source code here, you can see some new things. First of all, we still have both style tags here, but this data v here is new. So, and you can notice that there is one for the first section here, which I think is the float left, must be the sidebar, the content.view, but you also have one here with a different hash here, 38 something, and the one at the top here is a 62 something. So what does that mean? It's basically the Vue style loader that on the fly generate this hash and add it both to the style, to the class you set up, and also to all individual elements from your components. Okay. By doing that, it makes sure that the style written for a component only applies to that component. Okay. I have
Stéphane?
This lot. Yes.
Stéphane, a quick question. We have a question in the chat just before we move too far. The question is, the Vue style loader put that style on the header in real time when mount the component, or when it compiles through the Vue CLI Webpack? compilation process.
So Vue style put the style on the header in real time when mount the component or when it compiles through. Okay, so it puts it, actually the Vue style loader generates a piece of JavaScript that is loaded when you load the app. So if we look in details, actually, where is that? Here, actually here. This is the code from Vue style loader here, okay? So it will generate this JavaScript here and put it on your page. And this is generated on the fly, right? Here, this creates the elements on the fly. So at that point, this piece of JavaScript is already loaded on your page, okay? It will just execute at some point in time. So this creates the element, but also there is another function, I don't remember exactly where, that puts the content of the style. Because here, as you can see, it just creates an empty style element and put it on the DOM. And then elsewhere, it generates the actual content of that template. I don't know if it answers the question.
Yes, so I think, so like you say, it's Vue style loader will prepare the JavaScript that will execute once we run the page, we run the Vue app, and that's the point where it gets in the head.
Yep.
All right.
Exactly. So yeah, we thought we fixed the issue with the scoped attribute, but not quite ready yet. Then, yeah, so when a style tag has the scoped attribute, actually the CSS, each CSS will only apply to the element of the current component. So the CSS from app.vue will only apply to app.vue, the app.vue templates. And I've looked at the source code, like how it does that. And I found that on the Vue loader here, they use a hash sum package to compute the hash based on the component name. And if you remember, 38 something is the hash for app.vue and 62 something is the hash for content.vue, is the content we have, those hash here, right? So you could look at the source code of the Vue loader here. No, actually that's the package, but I think it's this one. Put the link here, how it generates the hash. What's interesting to see here is on prod mode, it actually had the source code as in the hash function. So that means on prod, your hash will change also if you change the contents of your component, not just the component name. Probably to deal with caching issues, like to bust the cache or something like that. Honestly, you don't have to think about that when you use the scoped attribute, but that's useful, I think, to know how it generates, like achieving like what we call scoped CSS. CSS that only applies to a specific component. Okay. And I've put some like resources here if you want to know more about that. Cool. But we haven't fixed the issue. Huh? I mean, I've explained what it does, but how do we fix the problem? Actually, the cool thing with the single file component is that you can combine different style attributes, elements, sorry. So here I have the style scoped, but I extracted the body part in another tag style where this one is not scoped. And if you look at the code base, at the source code here on the browser, you can see that it has this style with the body without the data v element specification, and we keep the two other style elements, right? So I have the three, and now the app is completely like fixed and working as expected. Cool. Is there any questions so far? I'm gonna look. Yeah.
I put in the chat that my mind is blown. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, exactly. You can put like many style tags. Cool. Okay, so I'll keep going then. One last thing about the scoped style is sometimes you want to style a child component from a parent one without updating the code of the child component, right? So for this example here, let's say we want to add a border like on the H1 elements here, an orange border, and we could do it from the content.vue elements, components here directly, but we're gonna try to do it from the parent one. It's useful if you want to style some components you don't have access to the code, like when you're using a plugin and you want to just tweak a bit the CSS, but you can't change the CSS in the plugin. Okay, how do we do that? The first approach would be to say, fine, this is a H1. So I'm just gonna, from the app.vue components in the style scoped elements, I'm gonna just put main H1 and put the style there, the CSS here. But the problem is if you look at how it renders, because we used the scoped attributes, it happens like it add this prefix here, this suffix data v. So this is not a known element. H1 doesn't have this data v attribute here. Okay. How do we fix that? Actually, you can use what we call the deep selector. The deep selector is this triple arrow thing. And by doing that, you're saying, okay, everything after the triple arrow thing is actually a child component. So put the data v, the hash here, you put it before that. So then the CSS renders and applies properly like this. Small notes on the deep selector. If you're using Sass, the triple arrow won't work. So you'll have to use either /deep/ or like : v -deep H1. Those three here syntax are equivalent depending on either the preprocessor you're using. You'll have to use one or the other. Okay. So is there any questions so far? I think, let me look at the chat. Okay, good. Next topic is the module style. It's a bit different than the scoped attributes, but it achieved the same goal, I would say. It's when you want your CSS to be scoped to the components. And it's a level deeper because here, when you add the module attributes to your style elements, what it does is it actually breaks or like doesn't render at all how you would think it would render normally. Okay. And if you look at the source code here, you can see that your classes are all different. Like the names are completely different than the nav class here. Okay. So let's look why is that and how we achieve that. So the module attributes will tell Vue Loader to generate the CSS classes, but they won't, it will rename them on the fly with a hash and put them into the style object as a computed property. So if you want to use the nav here class or the content class, you'll have to be explicit about it. You'll have to say in your template, okay, this div here, this element, I want to apply the nav class. So you'll have to use the property, the data binding property here, $style.nav, and it will actually put the class you want here with the generated name, and your app will look the way it's supposed to look. Okay. It took me a long time to understand like why we would do that, and the whole concept of CSS in JS. It's getting popular, more and more popular, and I think I started getting it now. I don't use it on production environment yet, but it's very useful if you want to build a library, for instance, and you don't want your class to collide with other classes. Like that way you're sure that this class, I mean, I'm pretty sure no one will come up with a name like that. Okay, so you're sure that your class will not, or your element here, your style will not collide with any other existing classes. I've put some resources here also if you want to hear more or learn more about CSS modules here. Okay.
Do the modules also do scoped by default, or is it like, does it still have the restriction?
Well, it's kind of scoped by default, because if you don't put here the style.nav, you won't have the class on your source code here, so it won't render. It will actually, like when I've put module, only module, without touching the template, it would render like this. So you can see that none of my style applied. But it generated the tag here with the proper class code. It's just the class name is different.
Got it. Cool.
So here, if you put your class nav, it won't work, because you have to actually put this as the class name for your element. Okay, preprocessor. Let me ask a question on the audience. Who's familiar with preprocessor? Let me see. Few people. Great. Okay. For those who didn't answer, quick summary of preprocessor is basically a tool to pre-process your CSS before it's rendered. And there are like different preprocessor. They all have their different like goals or like a syntax, but basically it allows you to write more modular and maintainable CSS, and you can do CSS like this where you can nest CSS classes, CSS element, and you can do function, variable. You can do a lot of stuff with preprocessors. And it's not a Vue thing; it's like a front-end tools. Okay, but in Vue and actually with Webpack, you can set up preprocessor. So when you use them in single file components like this here, all you have to do is put the preprocessor you want to use, and then Webpack will compile on the fly and generate the CSS for you. In order to do that, first of all, you have to install your preprocessor, and then you also have to configure Webpack by adding a rule here, and you say, okay, all the files that are .scss here, you're going to use one of those loader, Webpack loader, in order. So first try with Vue style loader, then try with CSS loader, then try with Sass loader. Okay. And on your components, all you have to do is put the lang here that will tell Webpack, hey, this is a .scss component. And it works with less, it works with, what are the others, like Stylus, Sass, anyway, all the others, I guess, works. With Vue CLI, it's embedded by default, so you won't even have to do the rule Vue CLI 3. You can just put the, you have to install first the loader, obviously, but after that, you can just put the lang SCSS and it will work. As you can see here, I've combined the scoped attributes and the lang attributes. Okay, so that was the last slide for the CSS. This one, actually, this one is my last slide. Some tips I've learned over the years. First, there are different ways to import your CSS in single file components. And those are the three main ways to import your CSS. Basic way is to just do inline. You put your CSS in the style element. That's it. But you can also import, you can extract your CSS in a different file and import it like this. And again, you can combine, you can have some inline styling and some file import. And the last one is you can also import your file with a CSS import syntax here. And if you know another way, like a fourth way to import CSS, I'm all ears. I mean, yeah.
There's one variation in Nuxt where you could do it in the nuxt.config.js file. So that's sometimes used, but I tend to prefer putting it into the component, which could, in that case, also be the default layout. But yeah, the main difference would be that the stuff in the Nuxt config basically just goes straight into the head. I don't know if it does any processing unless you configure it, although it might have changed. So
yeah.
Yeah, you're right. I've found that really useful for global variables, right? So if you want to set a brand primary color variable or something like that, that works really well to do that in the config level file rather than the component. But otherwise, I think you're right. You want to style something locally.
Yeah, I'd like to do that too. But I'm getting more into the habit of doing everything in the component.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another tip when you're working with modules, if you don't want to use the $style computed property, you can actually name or change the identifier of your module. And here what I did is I said this style tag here is a module, but change the name to custom. So in your template, all you have to do is use custom as the computed property, like custom.red. And you can, I haven't put the example here, but you can have multiple modules with different identifier on the same Vue file. So honestly, I don't know why you would do that, but if you find a valid use case, I mean, I'm interested. But it's doable. Technically, you can have like a style with module custom 1, custom 2, blah, 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 and then you can refer to them in your template with the identifier. And the last tip is when you're dealing with import, CSS import on large application, I would say, or where the CSS file you want to import is not next to the component file. So instead of doing relative imports like this one here, which is not very, it works, it's not maintainable, because if you change the folder structure, then you're screwed. You have to, every word that you imported like this, you have to change the path. What you could do instead is configure Webpack to create an alias here. It's actually a Webpack alias, okay? But you can use Webpack aliases in your style tags with the tilde character here. So the same way you would import, I think it's @CSS. No, it's just import CSS on the script tag. You can use the tilde CSS here will resolve into this URL here. I've put the Webpack configuration here for Vue CLI. So the syntax is a bit different for pure Webpack, but I think this is the key here. Resolve alias, and you put your alias. And then you can use it with the tilde.
That is very cool. I didn't know about that. I don't know Webpack that deeply, so that's really helpful.
And that concludes my presentation. I think that's all I had today. I'm open to questions. I'm going to open the chat quickly. And participants, okay.
Don't hesitate to ask your questions. Maybe just one question for you, Stéphane, more like in general terms, like, so you have some experience with CSS. I guess you have seen things you regretted. Maybe you have did things you regretted, other things that you said, oh, that was awesome. Is there any thing that comes to mind, maybe things to avoid or really good tips that
Yeah. Let me think. I don't have that much experience in CSS because I'm not a CSS developer. So, but in terms of management, CSS management, or like a big application structure, I would say actually the Webpack aliases. It's when you start a new project, or even if it's a big project, like you should always have aliases. Because as soon as you put that kind of relative import in the code, then people, especially in large teams, tend to copy paste without creating the alias. And then at some point, you just want to change one CSS file to another folder, and you have to touch like 50 components. And then you're scared because your app is not tested. And then it takes like days to just move a file. So I would say the alias here is a big win here early on, even later in your project. Other than that, I would say we started to, in one of our projects, we started to extract the CSS files like this in different files next to the component. So we have like a app.vue, and then we have app.scss. So it's kind of clear that when we want to update just the CSS, we have to touch the CSS file and not the component. So makes things clear.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And let's say if you have
scope. Sorry.
Yeah, scope. Yeah, I was thinking. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I remember at the beginning of the presentation, I said, oops, this is the only slide you need for tonight. And actually, that's true, because what you should do is always scoped style in all your components. I don't think there is a reason to not have a scoped attribute unless it's your main component, like the home page or the app. Even there, I wouldn't put the style. I don't know. I'm not a CSS developer, so I don't know where I would put it.
I have kind of a funny story about that, because when I learned about this initially, I immediately went to module, and now I understand why I couldn't really get it to work. I didn't understand it. But what I found is that, because I'm not really a CSS person either, but when I'm working in VS Code, if I start typing style, the default is to do scoped.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started doing that, it became really painfully obvious what it meant. It's like, it's going to work only in this context and never for the children and never for the parent. So they feel strongly enough that it's the default in VS Code. So yeah, I try to just work with that. And then if I don't really want that, then I'll undo it.
So I would say use the scoped attribute and use a preprocessor, and I think you're good to go.
I think that would be also very useful if you're building your library components, let's say a design system or things like that. So that each component stays contained. And by the way, maybe the module thing, that you can name your module. Maybe you can have a name when you're like, for every component inside your design system, and any other like project that use that design system might just use a default module and not collide, but I'm not even sure. That was a hypothesis I had about why you could do that, but
yeah, I'm not too sure about the module yet. For sure, when you're building a design system or library, at least scoped, then module is because here, this class especially if you're building a library that is used in, you don't know where it's going to be used, and you don't know if someone has already a class called nav and doing some other styling. So you don't want your components here to use the nav class. Okay, so by using the module attribute, you're sure that no one will ever have used that class name.
Or maybe in that case also use a specific module, like I think the slide after that. So you can specify the name.
This thing here?
Yeah, custom thing.
No,
then you would be absolutely sure,
no,
I guess. That.
No, because here, this only changed the identifier of the computed property. So instead of $style, you use custom. But in the end, it will still resolve into that. It's just here in your source code here, instead of style, you can use the module or custom or whatever identifier you put.
I guess then it's if you have something named $style in your Vue instance, that would be the reason. Maybe you could use it.
Cool.
All right.
Any other questions?
I think people are happy, saying thank you, thank you.
There is a question. How would you manage CSS reset or normalize the SFC component config? Good question. I would say if you really want to put the resets or the normalize in your parent component, like the first component, like app.vue, I think you would put it in inline, like here. So not scoped. Actually, like I did on this slide, if I go back here. Yeah, here. So in the code, app.vue is the parent component. So I extracted the body styling into its own style attribute without the scope. So now it generates like this. That said, I just noticed that, see the order of style here. I think it matters when you're resetting stuff. So for reset and normalize, I wouldn't put it in the component. I would just put it in your template in the base HTML where it renders. So you're sure it's like the first thing.
Yeah, sounds like a good idea. Or probably if you have a preprocessor, to put it at the top of your preprocessor list of imports.
Or if you do the require, like the Nux config, when you...
I think that goes into Vue Meta.
Yeah.
It's Vue Meta that does it in Nux.
Another question, what about CSS in GS? Out of style tags? Not sure what you mean. Do you mean like without using the module here? Out of style tags.
I'm not sure either about out of style tags.
Oh, okay. So without module, well, if you, first of all, here, if I remove the module attributes, the style computed property won't exist. So this will not work. I will have to use the .nav class in my div. Now, obviously, you could, where is the scope, the module resources? You could manually, it's not there, yeah, here. Manually install CSS modules. But if you work with single file components, that's the way to go with the module attributes. Otherwise, you would have to install it manually outside in Webpack, configuring it in Webpack. Yeah, it's just easier to put the module tag. Okay. Yeah, if you want to learn, read more about it, CSS module, there is this link here that explains what it is, and it's like a framework agnostic. So yeah, you can read about that.
That's like the best icon for CSS modules of all time.
Yeah, that's how I do CSS, so I can relate.
Do you know the Peter Griffin from Family Guy CSS animated GIF
No,
or
I haven't
GIF?
seen it.
It's worth like searching for. It's like Peter Griffin like doing the like opening a curtain. So it's Peter Griffin CSS. It should get you there. And
Where is my?
I feel like this is like what animated things are made for.
Oh, yeah. I saw that. Okay, YouTube video. Yes. That's totally me doing CSS.
Yeah, me too.
And then I'll just leave it all broken.
But we had some good links in the chat for Flexbox CSS
Yeah,
tutorial
Flexbox
and also CSS
and
grid tutorial.
CSS, yeah.
So that will never happen to you. So.